In the afternoon we had wanted the nightfall. During the night we waited impatiently for the morning. At least then we could see what was going on in our immediate proximity. Whereas in the darkness, however, the men were running back and forth, the APs were moving about, and the Russians were interspersed among them. For that reason, we could not begin any firefights. We were afraid of hitting one of our comrades. We had already had enough bad experience with that. During the early morning hours of April 20th, the Führer's birthday, the anti-tank ditch had been levelled, and the T-34 prepared for demolition. Our engineers had packed everything imaginable into it so that it actually would disappear from the road after the demolition. We therefore preferred to get back into our tanks for a short time. The engineers had called out to us while moving by that the demolition fuse was already burning. The thing flew apart with a murderous explosion. We assumed that Ivan would come to life after that, but nothing appeared to stir him. He had time and knew how strong he was. I made my way to the command post once again to discuss the operation with the commander of the Fusilier battalion. Graf Strachwitz allowed himself to be disturbed during the night only by exceptional circumstances. Lieutenant Famula reported that the Graf was sound asleep and in pyjamas as usual. Famula added that he only rarely allowed himself to be talked out of doing that. It couldn't really be that bad, Famula said, if the Graf was showing such calmness. Because the Graf wasn't there, we discussed matters with the battalion commander. At H hour, a Nebelwerfer regiment was supposed to fire a 5-minute barrage on point 312. The observer could employ the artillery according to our wishes. In the meantime, the infantry battalion had already arrived at our positions. It was in the ditches along the road left and right of the tanks and waited for the attack order. I looked at my watch somewhat nervously. That was probably about 5 minutes before the initiation of the preparatory fire. We were already warming up the engines. None of us felt quite right. Everyone had thought to themselves that the Graf would call off the operation during the night. That would have saved us a lot of men and materiel, but it turned out that we would have to wait on an hour-by-hour basis for 2 complete days for the order to withdraw. At H hour, we heard the howling caused by the punctual firing of the Nebelwerfer batteries behind us. I was just about to observe where the fire fell when terrible detonations made the earth shake all around us. It appeared that all hell had broken loose. All of the hatches flew open because of the air pressure. We had the feeling that our lungs would burst. My first thought was that Ivan had monitored our radio traffic and had started their attack at the same time we did. Unfortunately, that was a false conclusion. But how could I have known that our own Wonder Boys were shooting too short? Those unwelcome rockets with their deafening noise came at us from the rear. I had experienced the fire of a Stalin organ often enough, but compared to what happened there at the time, the Russians were rank amateurs. I immediately radioed the command post, but without success. Once the command to fire was given, then the planned salvo was fired off. Only rarely did we succeed in stopping it. We thus had to endure those terrible 5 minutes, and anyone who experienced them will never forget it. We were helpless in the barrage of our own Nebelwerfer. Even Ivan, if he had wanted to decimate our attack position, could not have shot better. I was never able to find out then or later how this miserable situation came about and who was responsible for it. The Nebelwerfer units had the same maps we did. It was a mystery how something like that could happen. When we were operating in the East Sack, I had requested rocket fire, and it had been denied because I had requested that it be fired 80 metres in front of us. The distance was considered too short. The same people now fired on their own accord right on top of us. Unfortunately, we couldn't talk to them to hold them accountable because the Nebelwerfer units quickly displaced and disappeared after every fire mission. That way, Ivan couldn't return the favour. After this incident, I could very well understand his feelings in that regard. As a result of the screw-up, the infantry battalion was smashed to pieces. Most of the men were wounded or dead. It was a gruesome sight. The neatly arranged beams in the anti-tank ditch had also been decimated. Despite all that, I got over to the other side of the ditch without problems. I set up with 3 tanks so the Russians couldn't seriously interfere with the evacuation of the wounded and dead infantrymen. Lieutenant Famula immediately sent a few APEs forward to load the wounded. We thought the time had finally come to give up our intentions. Instead of that, an order was sent. Determine whether you can advance. A new battalion is being sent to you. Some may consider that insanity or, depending on the times, a crime. But one can't judge the requirements of such a critical defensive battle from a civilian or peacetime perspective. As a minimum, I wanted to reach point 312 to have a better jumping-off point for an attack south the next morning. At the same time, it was also completely clear to me that we could never reach the Narwa. Ivan had long since mined the road through the woods. We moved out, but only a short distance. A tank had already become disabled, and the road had to be cleared again. I wanted to light up a cigarette. Kramer gave me a light, and at the same moment, a solid hit shook our tank. It must have been a colossal caliber, fired by an assault gun. This time, however, it came from the Russian side. The guns were located on the high ground to the left of us. The men to my rear had already identified the target and took it under fire. The entire commander's cupola had flown off my Tiger. I had shrapnel in my temple and face. The wounds bled profusely, of course, but nothing had happened otherwise. The entire affair could have turned out considerably worse. Kramer had always chastised my smoking. But he had been taught a lesson. If I hadn't bent over to light up my cigarette, then my head would have been in the cupola at the critical moment. It hardly needs to be mentioned that I would have lost my head in the truest sense of the word. I wouldn't have been the first one that had happened to. The reason could be found in a design failure. On the initial Tigers, the cupola was still welded. It rose up high and had direct vision slits. The cupola hatch stood up vertically when it was opened. Thus, from a distance, anyone could recognize that the tank was vulnerable from the top. A high explosive round only had to hit the hatch, and the entire charge then came down on the commander's head. If a commander wanted to close the opened hatch, he had to lean over on the outside of the vehicle and expose himself to the hip to unhitch a safety latch that released it. This faulty design was soon changed. Thereafter the cupola was rounded off. The commander looked indirectly through the vision slits with mirrors, and the hatch could be swung right horizontally and closed. The round that hit had ripped off the cupola right at the weld line. I was very lucky because if the round had hit somewhat higher on the hatch, I wouldn't have gotten off so easily, despite the saving grace of the cigarette. To finally get out of the Russian line of sight, we moved rapidly to point 312, which then meant that we were in the woods. I turned to the right to cover the path that ran into our road from the north. It was intended that the tank following me would provide security to the south. I immediately identified a Russian assault gun to the north and had my gunner take aim. Ivan bailed out, however, when he noticed that we were laying our sights on him. Kramer fired, and at the same time, another Russian assault gun hit us between the turret and the hull. The following tank had not reached point 312 yet. It remains a mystery to me how we got out of our Tiger. In any case, it happened as fast as lightning. We gathered in the ditch. I still had my headphones on, the only thing we saved. Naturally, we quickly disappeared into the next Tiger. The column started to move back to the anti-tank ditch, covering to all sides. In the process, another tank was knocked out and had to be pushed into the marsh to the left of the road. We intended to recover the damaged tank later. As one could imagine, we were fed up with everything. If the Russians had kept the overall situation in mind and waited a little bit longer to fire, we all would have certainly come back on foot. That marked the conclusion of our birthday present to the Führer. After moving back, we didn't suffer any more losses. In the meantime, the Graf had pulled a battalion out of our old front line to cover us. The Kampfgruppe, which had advanced from the north, also got hung up. According to reports from its command, the Kampfgruppe advancing to the south of us had reached the road between point 312 and the town on the Narwa. That was probably also the reason why we had to continue to wait. Perhaps they could have opened up the road from that location. The next day, we knocked out 2 enemy tanks during a Russian counterattack. Our damaged Tiger had to be blown in place by the engineers because it could not be recovered. On April 22nd, We moved our positions a little bit forward to make possible the towing of the second tank. The Tiger was towed back during the night. The Russians didn't hold back on their ammunition anymore once they knew that our operation had failed. We received a few hits from anti-tank guns because both exhaust pipes of our tank were glowing red and offered a good target. We dropped the one Tiger in front of the ditch. Further to the rear, we picked up Carpenetto's disabled tank. The Russian lame duck biplane considerably disrupted our movement to the rear. The superb Lieutenant Famula also fell victim to one of these bombs. He was surprised by one and mortally wounded by shrapnel while standing on the road. We finally reached our assembly area in good shape. We set up there in case of a Russian counterattack. At the same time, the infantry went back to its old positions. Von Schiller, together with Oberfeldwebel del Zeit, moved forward to recover another disabled vehicle. While mounting up, a piece of anti-tank shrapnel sought out del Zeit's hindquarters. He vented his spleen by continuously cursing up a storm. The Tiger we had left on the far side of the ditch also had to be blown in place because the infantry could not hold out under the Russian pressure. They had to withdraw that same night. That was the way the third Operation Strachwitz ended. We didn't gain 1 yard of ground but sacrificed many soldiers and tanks in the process. Our operations in the northern sector of the Eastern Front, especially the last few ones along the Narwa, hadn't made us happy despite the successes we had gained. Everyone realized, however, that our presence had been desperately needed. The infantry by itself was simply too weak to fight against such a superior foe. We had to reinforce the front by becoming the stays in the corset. Just the psychological support that only we could often provide sufficed to keep our ground pounders from giving up. Unfortunately, the losses sustained by indirect fire as a result of too much milling about were too high. The mechanical problems in the marshy terrain also occurred more frequently than usual. Proper tank terrain, where an entire company could be employed as a unit, was a seldom sight in the pathless areas of the north. Because of that, we often had to fill the vacancy of the missing defensive weapons. "The spirit of armour is the spirit of cavalry," a former company commander of mine used to say. He, like many tank officers, came from the cavalry. This comparison is very apt and demonstrates how the employment of tanks requires the room to manoeuvre, something which was never available in that sector. Only by attacking and counter-attacking were we fully able to use our manoeuvrability and the long range of the 88mm cannon. In the northern sector, where Ivan was always eluding us, we could only rarely inflict serious damage on him. Without our presence, however, the Narwa sector could not have been held at all. We made every effort possible to come to terms with the difficulties of the terrain, and in the process approached the limits of what was humanly possible. Even if we often cursed about vegetating in the marshy terrain, we were proud that the infantry had confidence in us and was, by and large, satisfied with us. The final Operation Strachwitz was our farewell performance in the Narwa sector. We assembled at our support base in Silima. Most of the tanks were being repaired and had to be overhauled from the ground up. Fortunately, Ivan also appeared to need some rest, and there was no major fighting in the following few weeks. Night, S-cross at the hospital. Our time in the Narwa area was thus brought to a close. At the end of April, the company received the order to follow our battalion to the area around Pleskow. Pleskow is the traffic junction on the Leningrad-Dunaburg road. It lies directly south of Lake Pleskow, which stretches north toward Lake Peipus. From Silima, we set out to the west to our railhead. Even without the direct intervention of the enemy, one can still have a lot of headaches with a tank. The infamous rain and mud period had arrived, and even the road was barely negotiable. The wheeled vehicles sank up to their axles, and we were afraid that our tanks would sink to their hulls. Every Tiger had 1 to 2 trucks in tow. The trucks couldn't move forward using their own power. The mud dammed up in front of the radiators. If the tow cable was strong enough, it ripped out the truck's front axle along with its wheels. When we finally arrived at the train station, most of the vehicles were ready for the repair shop. The bulk of them had to be towed onto the rail cars. We looked forward to the train trip. We could stretch out on the straw in the cars for the enlisted men and finally sleep undisturbed for the first time in a long time. We didn't anticipate any alerts at all during the trip. We therefore took good advantage of the time, since no one knew what awaited us in the area around Pleskau. Of course, I had also taken our company dog, Hasso, along with us. But when I woke up at a stop, he had disappeared. According to accounts from the men, he had jumped out of the moving train, probably to fetch something that somebody had thrown out. I thus lost a good friend whom I sorely missed, even if he was only the four-legged kind. The battalion had reserved a village for us where we were supposed to draw quarters. It appeared we were supposed to enjoy a few weeks of quiet. This fact didn't sink in for me until the new commander, Major Schwaner, paid us a visit shortly after our arrival. At the time, we didn't know him. He asked me to draw up training schedules for the next 4 weeks. That didn't go down too well with me. I believed the men should first recuperate from the long, difficult operations. Naturally, even in a rearward rest position, the necessary duties still had to be performed during the day. But I really had no patience for gunnery instruction and similar nonsense, especially since there were no green troops among us. Amazingly enough, the rest didn't do me any good. I found out that even with the best intentions, there are limits to physical stamina. I suffered from asthma attacks that soon became so severe that I had to stop after every step. I could only move about with a Wollchow walking stick. The battalion physician, Dr. Schonbeck, looked after me. I was ordered to bed and was allowed neither tobacco nor alcohol. The fact that I also didn't have any desire for them told me how really bad off I was. But after a week, I had recovered enough to carry out route reconnaissance missions toward the front. We had to inspect the roads and bridges in our new area behind the front lines. We also had to establish contact with the troops in their positions so that we knew our way about in case we were employed there. For our operations in the Nawa sector, I had been awarded the Knight's Cross on May 4th. The company claimed that I had become sick only to get out of the battalion formation that had been scheduled for me. The award was therefore brought to me in my billets. The guys drank to my health while the commander kept an eye on me so that I didn't partake of any alcohol. Everyone shared my happiness. They knew that I would be there when we went to our next operation. 2 new officers, Lieutenants Nienstedt and Eichhorn, arrived a few days later to relieve me. My health had improved noticeably. Based on the peaceful situation in that sector of the front, I was granted a 4-week convalescent leave. As is well known, however, one should never count his chickens before they are hatched. I was barely home for 5 days when a telegram summoned me back to the unit. The frontline soldier must always be prepared for such eventualities. In wartime, usually only the soldiers in the occupied territories were able to enjoy an uninterrupted leave, even though they were already quite well off while in action there. One gets the impression that these privileged men are the ones who complain the most now about the miserable army and the horrible war. Among their ranks today, one also finds those who discriminate against the decent German soldiers and spinelessly support the consciously directed hate from other countries. In Riga, on the trip back to the front, I met Lieutenant Scheirer from the 3rd Company. He had received the same telegram as I did. He cursed up a storm and probably didn't even notice how happy I was to have some company on the trip. That made the sudden departure from home easier. When we both arrived at our destination train station and asked about our units, we found out that they had already been moved somewhere else. We then looked up Hauptmann Schmidt, the commander of an assault gun battalion, whom we both knew. He promised to put a Kubelwagen and a driver at our disposal to take us to our units. At the time, however, he wanted to party with us. We were thus able to drown our sorrows about the leave being cut short. The carousing was so high-spirited that we weren't even aware of our departure. We didn't come back to our senses until we stopped in front of the battalion command post. Instead of an enemy attack awaiting us there, as we had assumed, there was another party. Scheirer had been promoted to Oberleutnant. We thus had all sorts of reasons to wash down our anger. Our comrades had summoned us back from leave without any type of operation ahead of us that would have demanded it. The next day I drove to the company. It was quartered a fair distance away in a village. At first, the first sergeant didn't recognize me at all. He was about to salute by the book because he thought I was a new officer who had been transferred to the company. The mistake was soon rectified. Happy to see each other, we shook hands. It should be noted that I had brought back a new and completely regulation overseas cap from leave. It greatly changed my customary appearance. Up to then, I had always worn a form of headgear that bore no resemblance to that in the regulations. It had been sent to me by my mother at the time I was promoted to lieutenant. Since then, the cap had become completely washed out, more grey than black. It sat quite well on my head and didn't have an eagle or a cockade anymore. They had fallen off over time. It had always been a sore point with my battalion and company commanders. Despite numerous requests, however, I could not part with my old cap. It had always served me well and sat so comfortably that the headphones didn't bother me. Even during a heavy storm, I didn't have to worry about losing it. But this was a new field cap. I only wore it in the rear area, however. As soon as I put on my old assault cap, my men knew what was going on. The first sentry who saw me immediately woke up the crews. He knew for certain that things would be happening shortly. I had the opportunity during my first night back to pack my official cap in my trunk. That was because the Russians had broken through at Ostro, south of Pleskau. I could be grateful to them that they had waited for my return. We rolled out in the early morning hours. We reached the Rositten-Pleskau Rollbahn and approached the area of our operations. Ivan had broken through from the east toward the Rollbahn and controlled it. We were supposed to immediately force him back with a counterattack. We arrived at the infantry command post exactly 15 minutes before the start of the attack. As always, I sat outside the turret with the gunner during our move. I was to the left of and next to the cannon. By doing that, we could see better in the darkness and help the driver. In the process, I had apparently nodded off and suddenly tumbled past the driver's hatch and onto the road. Once again, luck was on my side. My driver, Barish, reacted as quickly as lightning and braked before the track could grab me. Without his presence of mind, I would have died a less than glorious death. Unfortunately, a messenger had worse luck than I did. He passed a tank and cut in front of it to turn right. When he lost control because of a pothole, he was run over and killed. Major Schwaner, our new commander, was participating in his first operation with the entire battalion. He was very proud to have all of his companies together and went to the regimental command post to discuss the operation. It wasn't as easy to talk to Schwaner as it was with the unforgettable Jutta. I had already clearly stated it was impossible to begin the attack at 8 a.m. I urgently requested that the time be postponed until at least 9 a.m. Schwaner had a different opinion. He soon came back from the command post, and despite my misgivings, we had to move immediately. The entire operation was thus condemned to failure from the very beginning. The coordination among the commanders was of secondary importance. It was important, however, that the tankers be given the opportunity to establish contact with the leaders of the infantry units. They had to agree upon the measures needed to work together with us. There was no time left for that, and the results were soon apparent. After a short distance, the infantry went to ground and were not seen any more. In their inexperience, the men had bunched together like grapes behind and next to the tanks. That drew the fire of the Russians' heavy weapons and resulted in the infantry suffering heavy casualties. Those who had not been wounded threw themselves to the ground to the left and right. Naturally, with the heavy fire, none of them dared to get up again. It was a complete mess. None of us knew a single one of the officers, and no one knew who actually belonged to whom. It was thus practically of no value that we reached the objective with our tanks. At the onset of darkness, we had to evacuate the position because we had no opportunity to mop up the Russian trenches and occupy them ourselves. Ivan was quite aware of that and didn't make any efforts to withdraw. He remained in his bunkers in front of us, feeling quite safe. The high ground from which our people had been tossed off was called, quite simply, the Judenese, or Jew's Nose. Readers with some misgivings needn't take offence at this designation. It had nothing to do with anti-Semitism. It simply said something about the shape of the high ground in terms that everyone could understand. The Judenese was fortified in such a manner that it continues to remain a mystery to me how it could have been lost. The Russians had taken it in a raid at night. This reverse can only be explained by the presumed carelessness of our men who felt too secure and hadn't been alert. The ridgeline rose steeply. The most direct way to it led through a narrow defile, perhaps 50 meters long. Only one tiger could fit in it. To the left and the right of the defile were trench systems arranged in a terraced format along the slope up to the crest. The trenches, which connected the bunkers with one another, were dug into the hill and must have been completely safe against direct fire. The Russians had a reversed front in this defensive system. We had a detailed fortifications map at our disposal, and thus knew the location of every bunker and trench. I was supposed to conduct a frontal attack with the company. At the same time, the rest of the battalion, almost at full strength after its rest and refitting, was to advance to the right of us on a ridgeline that ran into the WWII. That would have meant that the entire battalion would have assembled there, one tank after another, becoming an easy target for the Russian artillery. Of course, that provided another opportunity for a falling out with the commander. He was already ill-disposed to me because of my objections to the start time of the attack. I said that I considered it nonsense to attack such a small objective with the entire battalion. For this operation, one company would have sufficed completely. If it had been up to me, I would have taken 4 tanks with me, and another 4 tanks would have advanced along the ridgeline so that no more than 8 tanks could have been lost. If those 8 tanks couldn't do it, then neither could the entire battalion, because the vehicles would have interfered with each other's fields of fire. My arguments were not accepted, and I was dressed down. According to the lessons taught by the sand table, the entire battalion just had to be employed. Unfortunately, I couldn't change any of that. One always had a good feeling, however, when there were still a few vehicles held in reserve that could recover the others. I drove off quickly and reached the defile ahead of the others. We weren't in the best of moods while moving through there. Ivan could toss shaped charges down upon us with very little effort from the trenches and the upper edge of the defile. Each of us had to watch out for the others in order to avoid a gigantic mess. We arrived at the military crest without problems, however. 2 tanks had turned off to the left at the foot of the WWII. They followed a trail that ran diagonally along the slope to the crest and reached the edge of a patch of woods, at the other end of which we were located. I had scarcely stuck my nose over the crest, however, when I heard a decent-sized round rush past me. That made it advisable to remain on the backside of the crest. I later discovered that Ivan had set up assault guns and artillery not far in front of the far side of the slope. They completely dominated the crest. Any advance would have been suicide. Besides, we had reached our former positions. They only needed to be occupied. Our infantry was kilometres to the rear, however, and appeared to be sleeping. In any case, I didn't see a single infantryman for the rest of the day. In the meantime, the rest of the battalion approached us from the right. Although I was in radio contact with the battalion commander, my own boss, he hit me from the right with an anti-tank round between the glacis plate and the turret. He had gone with the other group. The round knocked the wind out of our sails. If he had aimed a little bit more to the left, none of us would probably have had enough time to get out a single curse. Fortunately, he finally recognized us, and the matter stopped with just the one hit. He simply couldn't understand how I had already reached my objective. Lieutenant Naumann, a new man in the battalion and in combat for the first time, drove at high speed at the front of the Kampfgruppe to the right. He stood exposed in the turret and could be seen down to his belt buckle. That sort of thing had nothing to do with boldness. It was suicidal madness. The life of the crew was also irresponsibly placed on the line. I immediately switched over to his company's frequency and continuously transmitted that he should drive more slowly and be more careful. When none of that helped, I gave him the exact distance he still had to drive before Ivan saw him and knocked him out. I could observe everything after all, and knew how far forward we dared to go. But Naumann didn't hear, or he simply didn't want to hear. He got up to the place I had specified and promptly received a devastating direct hit. His tank disappeared from view for a short time. His crew became the only one listed as missing in our battalion. No one in the tank came back. None of us approached the Tiger because it was in the middle of extremely heavy enemy fire. How could a tank commander sacrifice his crew so senselessly? I could not comprehend it then. Even today I still cannot understand the actions of that young comrade. The 3rd Company had recently received a new company commander, Hauptmann Leonhard. We were lucky and won the grand prize with him. Leonhard was the kind of man whom everyone wants to have as a company commander. I owe him a lot of thanks. He always helped me, the little lieutenant, whenever I wanted to convince the commander of something for the company. There we were, on the crest of the hill, waiting for our infantry. Actually, only the optimists among us waited, because the infantry usually didn't follow. If we wanted them to come along, we had to take them with us during the advance. At any rate, these men had taken such heavy losses in wounded that they would not have been strong enough to hold the position through the night. The Russians fired with increasing frequency and accuracy. Their observers probably sat in the trenches behind us to the left. They had simply stayed in their positions because they had no reason to give up ground to us. What could we have done to them? We thus lost one tank after another, especially in the right-hand battle group, which was in an even more disadvantageous position than we were. Von Wesely, who was all the way on the left on the far side of the little patch of woods, soon reported that he had received a hit in the turret from an assault gun that rendered him combat ineffective. Von Wesely had moved up to engage the enemy and give us a little breathing space. The Russians were sharp, however, and didn't even let him get off a shot. He had barely stuck his nose over the crest when a muzzle report was heard. After 4 tanks in the right-hand group, one of mine, and then that of Wesely, had become disabled, the commander pulled back with the rest of his Tigers to fetch the infantry. I was supposed to hold the crest for as long as needed. During the day, we could still do that, even though we saw Ivan being continuously reinforced, and above all, becoming quite lively to our rear. We wouldn't have had any chance at all at night. At the onset of darkness, and without waiting for orders, I decided to drive back through the defile. No human in his right mind could have demanded that I remain there overnight with the 3 remaining combat-ready tanks, or that I try to get back through the defile in complete darkness. We made it through that dangerous area without incident, and also picked up the crew of Lieutenant Eichhorn en route. His vehicle wouldn't start anymore, and no one had looked out for him. That meant that yet another Tiger was left in the open, a really depressing conclusion to our efforts. When I finally arrived at the jumping-off position, I discovered that none of the infantry entertained thoughts about coming forward that night. I was thus thoroughly pleased with my decision not to remain there. Major Schwaner didn't raise any objections, and probably realized that I had been right with my moaning and groaning in the morning. Everyone has to pay dearly for experience. In the early morning hours of the next day, we brought our infantry halfway up to the Judenese, so it would have a shorter distance to our objective. The men formed a skirmish line there, and were able to occupy the old positions with the remaining forces without any problems. The terrain was somewhat flat, but wooded in places, and good camouflage was possible. To the left of the trail that led to the Judenese, we could see a ridgeline about 800 meters away, which ran parallel to us. A Russian attack was in progress there. I could observe the close-quarters combat with my binoculars, and immediately fired into Ivan's flank. That helped our guys somewhat. The Russian lines ran into a depression halfway to the left in front of us. They were about a kilometre away and could be easily seen from above. The Russians moved about in such a happy-go-lucky manner that we had to fire off a few rounds to make them be more careful. Their brazenness was often amazing. Around noon, they drove with their prime movers, artillery pieces and ammunition trailers onto the open area of the forward slope, as if we didn't exist at all. We let them advance far enough down so that they couldn't quickly disappear over the crest, and then lobbed a few rounds in front of them. The distance was too great to hit with any accuracy, and the drivers were able to save themselves before we hit their transportation and their tractors burned. The Russians realized that we had redeployed, and they abstained from attacking that day. It was clear that they were going to reinforce their positions on the Judenaz. They could certainly count on us attacking a second time. In the final analysis, The retaking of these fortifications was absolutely essential to us. The front to the left and right of us could not be held otherwise. The high ground we had lost dominated the terrain completely. It absolutely had to be retaken. The infantry reinforcements arrived the following night. Using the exact drawings of our fortress, I discussed the attack to be conducted in the morning in great detail with the battalion commander in his bunker. Every squad could thus be given a precise mission. Artillery support was also assured for the upcoming operation. Since all 4 of my tanks had been disabled during the day, 4 vehicles were attached to me from the 3rd Company. That meant I had to work with unfamiliar people. Despite that, everything went well because they already knew me. We moved out quickly at the onset of the preparatory fire. We reached the foot of the hill in front of the defile before the batteries shifted fire onto the high ground. The Russians hadn't even stuck their noses out of the trenches, and we were already covering them with fire. According to our agreement, the infantry had advanced almost as far as us by then. We covered the trenches with heavy fire while our men charged and occupied the first trench along the lower edge of the precipice. The rear 2 tanks shot it out with the 2 Russian anti-tank guns that had set up in the little patch of woods. They kept our flanks clear by doing that. These 2 tanks also had the mission to move up the path heading diagonally to the left along the slope. At the same time, I had to move through the defile with my 2 tanks. I waited until our artillery had shifted and then moved in quickly in order to get that defile behind me. Fortunately, I saw in time that the path had been blocked by exposed German mines. It was a critical situation because time was pressing. After all, the entire operation could not be allowed to fail because of 2 German mines. Therefore, there was nothing left for me to do but climb out and toss both of them to the side. I dismounted somewhat apprehensively while my comrades gave me cover and forced Ivan to keep his head in the trench. Miraculously, I actually got back into the tank in one piece, and we then slinked through our alleyway. Nowadays we can smile about it, but a tremendous load was lifted off our shoulders when we arrived unscathed at the top. Without a little bit of luck, even the best soldier can't do a whole lot. Our infantry cleared the trench system while we were covered with unbelievable artillery fire. We were lucky that the Russians didn't get a single direct hit. But what did our good old Tigers look like after this barrage? The dirt was so deep on them that we could have planted a small vegetable garden. It really was a miracle that we got out of that affair unscathed. On top of everything else, and to our astonishment, a few waves of close support aircraft also attacked us. They swept so closely over the crest that we thought we would be rammed. But even their numerous bombs and rockets didn't hit us. Unfortunately, as usual, there wasn't anything to be seen of our flyboys. Our infantry comrades sang the Tsarist Volga boatman whenever Russian fighter-bombers or ratters prayed and swooped above them in such a carefree and unimpeded manner. It was supplied with a different and more appropriate text, however. Its ending went like this. "You have a lot of fighter planes back home, so send me just one, yes, one of them on loan." We spent a lot of time on the crest and were continuously targeted by the Russian artillery. We were not destined to get out of that jam unscathed. While changing positions and backing up, the other tank threw a track due to a sloppy turning maneuver. The Tiger stood there, immobilized. The 2 other tanks, which had moved up on the reverse slope farther to the left, didn't let Weasley's disabled tank dissuade them. They also tried their luck. Of course, both of them were promptly hit. I immediately had to come to their aid. It was impossible for the crews to bail out in the heavy fire. The Russians observed every movement, and none of the men would have got out alive. I positioned myself next to both of the tanks in such a way that the men of one tank could climb out of a hatch and into my vehicle without being caught by enemy fire. All of them had been slightly wounded. I then recovered the crew of the second tank. The tank commander had a severe head wound. I immediately had to drive him back to the battalion command post because his life would have been in danger otherwise. The good major must have been all eyes when I returned alone with my Tiger. Before I could even make my report, he was already yelling at me. How was it possible to drive back alone and leave my comrades up front? My answer was very short. "Sir, every tank is immobilized. The rest of the men will come back on foot any minute now." I then left abruptly so he couldn't see how the tears welled up in my eyes, because I had lost another 3 of my faithful tigers. My nerves were shot after all the tremendous demands placed on them. Despite everything, we had reason to be satisfied. The infantry was back in its old positions, and the stated objective had been reached. The night time was used to recover the shot-up tanks. Right at the onset of darkness, I moved out with 2 tanks to tow back the vehicles that were right behind our lines. We then brought along personnel from the maintenance squad. They had to weld together the track of 1 Tiger on the WWIIs. The tank was just in front of our lines in no man's land. The light, which is unavoidable when welding, was screened by shelter halves. I placed my tank in front of the other vehicle to protect the men who were working. Once again, we had our problems with the infantry. One could only drum it into their heads so often not to fire illumination rounds while men were occupied with recovering a tank. There were always people who had to have their own way and shot those things sky high. In the process, Ivan couldn't help but figure out what we were doing there, since we stood out like a sore thumb in the glow of the flares. Fortunately, everything went well and without casualties during that operation. It is difficult for the uninitiated to conceptualize such work. One really has to have experienced just how a Tiger with only 1 track lets itself be towed cross-country. In our case, this also meant downhill and through a defile. Once past the defile, we started receiving machine gun fire from Wesley's destroyed tank. Ivan had already settled in underneath the Tiger on the hilltop. On top of everything else, the towed tank also slid sideways and into a small bomb crater. We were ecstatic when we finally got it out of the danger zone. Lieutenant Eichhorn's driver, Obergefreiter Lustig, whose name means funny in German, lived up to his name on that day. Without saying a word at the trains, he simply took off to check up on his disabled tank. He found it right in front of our front lines in no man's land. It was in a condition that readily indicated that Ivan had already rummaged through everything. To the joy of our friend Lustig, however, he found a bottle of liqueur that the Russians had probably overlooked. He drank himself a little courage from the bottle and then actually got his tank running again. When we were ready to tow the next Tiger and were moving up the defile, Brother Lustig approached us. We immediately latched onto him so we could simultaneously recover both of the tanks that were still on the high ground. Lustig was so tipsy that he couldn't drive a straight line. We were often close to bogging down with yet another tank. The recovery took its toll of nerves and patience by the time we had finally done it. By morning, we had brought back all the Tigers, except for Weasley's tank, where the Russians had settled in. Supported by a patrol of infantry, we also tried to get to this vehicle the following night. Our intentions came to naught, and we gave up on the recovery effort to spare the infantry even more casualties. We shot Weasley's Tiger into flames in the morning. Despite the debilitating losses, we only had 1 complete loss to complain about. It had been proven once again. The recovery of a tank after an operation usually cost more in nerves than the operation itself. Because of that, I tended to go into action with as few Tigers as possible whenever we found ourselves on the defence. Our success had proven me right. We had reached the old front lines on the WWIIs by ourselves. That is, the same objective which the entire battalion had failed to reach before. Making our second effort even more difficult was the fact that the Russians had been able to reinforce and build up their positions in the meantime. They were also prepared for a new attack during the second operation. By contrast, surprise certainly would have contributed to the success of the operation during the first attempt had it succeeded. When we were successful on the second attempt despite those disadvantages, it was really no miracle. On the contrary, it showed the benefits of a thorough discussion of every phase of the operation with the infantry and the artillery. If our commander had allowed the first operation to be delayed in order to prepare the attack in detail, then the entire matter would have become a Sunday drive in the country, especially since the entire battalion was attacking, and the Russians hadn't properly set up yet. Decisive in every operation is the degree to which units don't work beside one another, but with one another. I always found that a proper infantryman, who had already been at the front for a while, couldn't be talked into a tank, even by threat of force. He certainly appreciated the advantage that our armour offered us, but he also knew the disadvantages of our tin crates. We presented the enemy with a much larger target and had to put up with the barrages that seemed to concentrate on us. The infantryman, on the other hand, could keep his distance. He skillfully exploited every depression in the ground to bury his nose in the protective earth. The armour leader was always responsible for the success of an attack. It was thus in his own best interest to ensure that the infantry followed along, but that could not be done if one closed his hatches and blindly headed off for the objective. The foot soldiers never followed once contact with them was lost. The fighting on the first day of the attack, which had ended without any success, had proven that one more time. There is now talk about constructing helmets with built-in receivers. Even if radio contact from the tank to every infantryman should come to pass in a modern war, the need for personal contact will never go away. This is especially true when the troops are an unknown quantity to the armour leader. One could transmit for a long time before the infantry went to the receive mode. Every good tank commander has to leave the comfort of his vehicle, even if it is often very difficult to do. He has to show the infantry there is life in those tin cans, and that we tankers are also willing to hold our own in the open without our usual protection. I was consistently successful in getting a completely bogged-down attack rolling again. I never had the experience where our troops remained in place whenever a tanker preceded them, setting a good example. There was something else that helped. None of us tankers had a helmet. That created the completely undesired impression of being especially gutsy soldiers. A helmet was certainly part of our basic issue, but those things hung outside the turret of every tank. They took up too much space in the vehicle. Consequently, they quickly got lost. No one could wear a helmet in the tank because there was then no room for the headphones. Besides, the thing was uncomfortable. A helmet was sometimes offered to me by considerate infantrymen whenever I went on reconnaissance with them, but the right size was never found, not unusual for people with big heads like me who wear a size 78s. The tankers who were new at the front also had something to learn in this respect. For example, they concluded that they were near the front because the infantry had their helmets on their heads or slung back around their necks. They had drawn a false conclusion, however. The soldiers simply didn't know any more comfortable way of carrying their helmets with them. It was more of a hindrance on the belt or anywhere else than where it actually belonged. When we were outside of the tank, we tried to justify our situation with the words of Lieutenant Rieger. "What do I need a helmet for if I get shot in the belly?" There was a bloody irony to these words. During the retreat to the Narwa position, Rieger actually died from a stomach wound. After its successful operation at the Judenaise, the battalion returned to its assembly area in the rear. Lieutenant Karl Ruppel from the 3rd Company and I were sent to the forward area rest centre at Reval to recuperate a bit. That was probably intended to make amends for the home leave that had been so abruptly interrupted. Besides, we were always immediately available in Reval in case we were needed. We would find out how much we were needed sooner than we would have liked. More about that later. My referral to the rest centre at Reval was based on a statement written by the battalion doctor. A physical had been conducted after my premature return from convalescent leave. The document stated that no more indications of a weakness in the functioning of the heart had been determined. This condition had first been detected in the fall of 1943. That meant that I had recovered surprisingly quickly. But then the findings went on. A 4-week stay at a rest centre would be appropriate due to the instability of his circulation and his reduced general state of well-being despite the leave. Strict abstinence from nicotine and alcohol is another prerequisite for attaining complete readiness for duty. New heart asthma attacks can be counted on in case of future physical stress of long duration. Karl Ruppel and I pulled out with the express to Reval. It is difficult nowadays to believe that we were en route for 8 days. That wasn't too much fun for us vacationers. The train would hardly move any distance at all before the locomotive started to switch rail cars once again. For a change of pace, there was another stop, Partisans. This unpleasant pace continued all the way to Reval. To my surprise, the manager of the home, who already knew me from 1943, sent a vehicle to the train station. We received magnificent rooms with running water, flushing toilets, and a bath. All the men were accommodated that way. One could get back in superb shape with the excellent food and the complete quiet there. On the first morning, we had breakfast with the proprietors of the home. We were in the process of telling them what had happened to us in the recent past, when an aide appeared. He handed each of us a telegram. We each made a nasty face, because I had already made a wager with Ruppel during our trip that we would never have 3 weeks of rest in Revel. I already knew my bet was as good as won. On the evening of our arrival, we had heard about the breakthrough of the Russians along the front at Vitebsk on the Wehrmacht news report. I naturally had an idea of what was in the telegram. Report immediately to the unit. We cursed up a storm, and my good upbringing prevents me from repeating it. We were less upset about being needed than having made the boring trip completely in vain. We had the same trip ahead of us one more time. We thus returned to the troops even more on edge than when we left. We discovered at the front control point at Pleskau that our unit had already been yanked into the area south of Dieneburg. It had been thrown at the open flank of the Russians, who were already making a rapid advance toward Vilna. The enemy had learned a lot from us and was now marching along the same route that we had taken in 1941, unfortunately in the opposite direction. Originally, it was Vilna-Minsk-Vitebsk-Smolensk. This time, Ivan marched Smolensk-Vitebsk-Minsk-Vilna. The gods of war had ruled against us, a process in which the incredibly superior strength of our many enemies also contributed a lot. Our vacation train had to be divided into ready reaction forces along the Rossitten-Dieneburg stretch of the route, because the area was already threatened by partisans. We arrived in Dieneburg without incident, however, where we were immediately transported to our units. It was incredible. Everything looked like peacetime. The tanks were scattered about in a state of recovery, so to speak. The men who belonged to them had also pitched tents. They were sunning themselves and writing letters. Naturally, everyone knew that this nice state of affairs couldn't last very long. Because the trains were still located with the combat elements, we had quite extraordinary rations compared to what we normally received. Whatever had been too monotonous during operations was overcompensated here to the point of luxury. Not one person ate the soup because it was too fatty. Who even wanted the official meal when anyone could scavenge for himself to his heart's content? It should be mentioned that the unit raised a large herd of livestock in the form of cows, pigs, geese, ducks, and chickens. A special section was set up for maintaining the livestock. Soldiers in Russian captivity later received sentences of 25 years for such crimes. In any case, we lived luxuriously during that period, so much so that the people back home could have envied us for a change. We ate all the delicacies on hand. No one knows as well as a soldier how fleeting earthly goods are. Ivan frequently led us about by the nose. He pursued the objective of tying up our forces. He never conducted a massed attack to the north from his flanks. We were occasionally alerted by a regiment, but it never amounted to anything. On July 11th, near Carasino, we had our first real contact with the enemy. The Russians weren't quite in agreement with the way our positions ran there, and the fact that we were slowly starting to rebuild them. We therefore had to help our friends in the infantry in occupying the dominating high ground. That was not a big problem for us, because the Russians themselves were not strong and hardly had any tank forces available. They were concentrating exclusively on the advance to the west. During the operation, we had the opportunity to knock out a single T-34, which had shown up along a wood line. Compared to what we were used to, it was a harmless incident. It was harmless, that is, except for our valiant Oberfeldwebel Zweti, a rascally fellow from the Styria area of Austria. After everything had already been taken care of, and we were resupplying behind high ground far away from the line of sight of the Russians, a ricochet hit him like a bolt from the blue. He was standing up on his tank and was helping to load ammunition when it hit him, of all places, on that part of the body so often covered in literature. In the Middle Ages, in Germany at least, you could still say in polite society that it hit him Arschlings, or ass first. Besides everything else, we also laughed, which made him intensely furious. Zweti, who had never had anything happen to him in combat, had to leave the company due to this unfortunate incident. The flesh wound would not heal without a stay in a hospital. I later saw him again at the 502nd Replacement Battalion in Paderborn, where he was his old self. 2 days later, the Russians came to life again at Carasino. We were employed in Grenadier Regiment 380's sector when I met Lieutenant de Reserve Bernd Schasler. He had received the Knight's Cross as a platoon leader during the winter and was serving as a liaison officer to us. As a real Swabian, he also had a real Swabian name that meant something akin to Little Treasure in English. After I was severely wounded, I met him again on the ship that was supposed to take us home. Schasler was only wounded in the arm that time and could still walk. I therefore didn't lay about so helpless and abandoned. He made sure that I could rest on the deck and took care of me during the entire long journey. During the orders conference in front of the command post of the 380th Light Infantry Regiment, we received an unexpected visit. A film reporter made an unannounced visit, and his film was actually used in a newsreel. To make his clip even more realistic, he asked permission to ride with me during the next operation. I was not inclined to do it because it was already cramped in our vehicles. But since the operation probably wouldn't be all that bad, I let myself be talked into it, for the first and last time. The gentleman from the newsreels got in the loader's position so that he could film out of the turret hatch. Our operation revolved around straightening out the front somewhat. Feldwebel Kircher advanced to the east a little bit too far, with the result that he almost became stuck in a swamp with his 3 tanks. I took up a position on the high ground and had great observation of the Russian positions. The enemy demonstrated little understanding for the intentions of the film man and was presumptuous enough to fire a few rounds at us. In short, the man never once got his camera out of the hatch. He always screamed "target" whenever we fired a shot. He made me so furious by doing that I remained on the hill until Feldwebel Kircher had returned. If I had been by myself, I would have long since disappeared behind the hill, but common courtesy to my guest demanded that he also experience something. Shortly before our return, the Russians came driving up with 2 tanks along the wood line about 1,200 meters in front of us. They didn't want to have anything to do with us, however. Instead, they drove across our front. I intentionally held back long enough so our man had his camera ready to fire. He could thus film the actual destruction of a Russian tank, but that didn't happen. My first round missed, at which point the Russians hurriedly disappeared into the protection of the woods. The effects of our round were even greater on the cameraman. He let himself sink into the turret as if hit when the round went off. Our loader, impeded by that, couldn't load, of course. Both of the Russians owe their good fortune to this reporter. I don't believe that our cameraman friend ever again uttered the wish during the war to be permitted to ride along in a tank. Ambition and readiness to do combat are 2 different things, especially in front of the enemy. I was ordered to division on July 15th. I was attached to a Kampfgruppe, which had constructed a defensive line with weak forces at Maruga, farther to the west. The leader of the Kampfgruppe had been the commander of a large city in the occupied Eastern Territories before his employment at the front. He wasn't quite in charge of the situation. In my presence, the divisional commander calmed him down on the telephone and assured him that I would show up by morning with my Tigers. Right at 6 o'clock in the morning, Lieutenant Eichhorn and I arrived in a Kiebel at the command post of the Kampfgruppe. To be mobile, it had been set up in a bus. I reported to the general, who was visibly surprised that he hadn't heard the approaching Tigers. He was even more astonished when I reported to him in a succinct manner that my vehicles were probably en route but would not arrive until around 8 o'clock at the earliest. The high-ranking gentleman said in an affable manner, "Well, my friend, you certainly are lucky. Our attack, for your information, begins at 8 o'clock. Sometimes it isn't easy to talk to a general, especially at such critical moments." I tried to explain to him there was no way I could be combat ready at 8 o'clock, because I had to conduct a reconnaissance of the routes up to the front. Besides, a meeting with the commander of the infantry battalion was absolutely necessary. The high-ranking gentleman was of a different opinion and quickly became impatient. The roads and the bridges have already been checked out by the assault gun people. Wherever they can drive, you too can also get through with your vehicles." Many a person would have simply clicked their heels and left by then. There was too much at stake, however. I explained that an assault gun had barely half of our weight, and that, as a matter of principle, I never relied on reconnaissance conducted by others. I had already had a lot of bad experiences as a result of faulty reconnaissance. By then, however, my general had lost his patience. He thundered, "You! I will not tolerate prima donna behavior by young officers. You will attack at 0800. Nothing was left for me to do but roll over and play dead. "I respectfully request the General's forgiveness," I said, and turned around. Lieutenant Eichhorn had already disappeared. He didn't have a good feeling. There was absolutely no doubt in my mind that I would not attack at 0800. I didn't want to put the old man's nerves even more on edge, however, and I drove off. The commander of the infantry battalion was very happy when he saw my black uniform. He immediately told me, however, that he couldn't possibly be ready for the attack at 8 o'clock. We were in immediate agreement with one another and set H-hour for 10. Kirsch's repaired tank had been promised by that time by the maintenance squad. As always, I could depend, down to the minute, on the tank being ready. Besides, the infantry didn't have its wire in place yet, and the commander had no communications with his companies. We went up to the front line together, and the major briefed me on the terrain. The objective of the attack was high ground, which we could see off to the right of us, about 3 to 4 kilometers in the distance. It dominated the terrain in all directions. Once this high ground was in our hands, the position could be held with significantly weaker forces. By contrast, the present one was very weak. It should be mentioned that Ivan was sitting in front of us along a wood line. In comparison, our lines practically ran across open terrain. They were completely dominated by the Russians. When we finally had the objective directly in front of our eyes, Feldwebel Kirscher noticed that the Russians were putting 2 anti-tank guns into position on top. We were driving broadside to the high ground and toward the right in order to go around a marshy area that separated us from the objective. From that point on, 2 of us constantly covered the movement of the other tanks. God knows there are a lot of things a tanker can imagine that are nicer than being forced to show his broadside to the enemy. But what could we have done differently in that situation? We had to approach the high ground regardless, and Kirscher soon finished off the anti-tank guns. It was thus even more incomprehensible to me that the tank behind me did not follow. A Feldwebel, who had recently arrived from the replacement battalion, was its commander. Up to then, it had always been a matter of course for every tank commander to at least move even with me. I even had to hold back the men most of the time, so they didn't range too far ahead of me. Feldwebel Kirscher had taken care of the Russian anti-tank guns. He could not follow me, however, because the other vehicle impeded him. I had reached my limit, and I ordered the gunner to relieve the commander. The radio operator had to replace the gunner, and the new Feldwebel had to cool his heels in the radio operator's seat. How many of the men in the company were just waiting to be made tank commanders? And this one didn't even appear to have a whole lot of desire for the job. When we got back in the evening, I transferred him to the trains where he could make himself useful. In any case, he couldn't be used up front with us. We then reached the high ground and remained there until the onset of darkness. The terrain we had driven through was completely clear of the enemy, except for this high ground. Naturally, Ivan also considered it important. Only the line across from our main line was thinly held. But for reasons unknown to me, our infantry didn't move at all. That was a decisive factor for me. While we were still able to see our tracks somewhat, I reported to the Kampfgruppe that we would be coming back. I wasn't about to remain alone in the midst of the Russians and have myself blown sky-high during the night. Nothing could be seen of the group with assault guns that was supposed to make its way to us from the enemy's rear, off to the right. During the afternoon, we had heard a short firefight from that direction, but nothing else. Our mission was therefore completed, and we returned to the command post of the Kampfgruppe without incident. The question remains unanswered as to whether we should have stayed there from the very beginning. After all, The loss of the 2 anti-tank guns hadn't weakened the Russians, and we had used more fuel and ammunition than the entire thing was worth. Nonetheless, our general was mightily proud of our accomplishment. In an affable manner, he said to me, "Of course, prima donna behavior is forgiven if the performance on stage is worthy of a prima donna." Basically, the high-ranking gentleman was extremely happy that it hadn't become as critical in his sector as he had feared. In his eyes, we were the main reason for that. We received another small mission farther to the west. I was once again able to get out of it before it came to its execution. Ivan had positioned artillery to cover his flank. Any movement to either the west or the east, right behind the front, caused the Russians to cry out or scream, "Tigri! Tigri!" Immediately afterward, the artillery guys fired a protective barrage along the entire front. It was thus best for us to keep quiet until something really did happen. It should be noted that the Russians weren't about to display their tanks to us at all. They constantly appeared behind some high ground with their vehicles and got the infantry in an uproar. But before we arrived, the apparition had disappeared. The most that we then heard was the sound of diesel motors moving away. Ivan just didn't want to let us get any rest. Massed attacks never took place. Our enemy also didn't have the strength for them. His main columns drove steadily to the west, and unfortunately we were much too weak to be able to cut off his advance. For that reason, it remained relatively calm on the flank where we were. As our general put it, the new line in the sector of the Kampfgruppe made an unsightly bend to the north. He therefore wanted to have that section straightened out. To do that, we were supposed to take a village. The front line was then supposed to run in a straight line through it. I drove there with my Kiobel to take a look at the matter for myself. The regimental commander briefed me. When I told him the general's intent, he indicated he thought the general was crazy. The entire village was located in a valley, in no man's land. Our lines ran along the high ground along a wood line to the north of it. The Russians were also on a slope to the south of the village. It would have been sheer insanity to occupy the village. During the day, one wouldn't have made it there at all, perhaps those of us in the tanks, but certainly no infantrymen. By comparison, our current lines could be held by our weak forces without a problem, because they dominated the approaches. Even if this line didn't look very pretty on the map, it was the only possible one in this terrain. The general soon called the regimental commander and ordered the attack on the village. The colonel was beside himself. To his relief, I declared I was prepared to drive immediately to General Berlin, to whom the Kampfgruppe was attached, to prevent the ordered operation. General Berlin recognized the correctness of my ideas and smiled about the minor mutiny. He called up his Kampfgruppe commander, and our front lines remained as they were. Our infantry and our tigers were too good for such nonsense.